Okay. Now, there's a section here. It's the reflections on the massacre itself, and it's talking about this first, like I said, this first thing that took place in Yosefov. It was their first big action as a group. So here we go back to the book. At Yosefov, a mere dozen men out of nearly 500 who responded instinctively to Major Trapp's offer to step forward and excuse themselves from the impending mass murder. Why was the number of men from the beginning declared themselves unwilling to shoot so small? And he kind of offers an explanation here. It's like the suddenness of it.
Mm-hmm.
And people are kind of surprised. And I can make sense of that, right?
Yeah.
Like if I gave you time to think, if I was like, hey, Echo, we got to go do this thing right now, you'd probably be like, okay, cool, let's go do it.
Right.
But if I said, hey, Echo, we're gonna go do something tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'll pick you up at 10:30.
Yeah.
Let me know. Well, now you have time to contemplate.
Yeah.
So he surprised him with it. There's also, obviously, there was peer pressure, right?
Yes.
To conform. And, that's going to play a role, and we'll talk about that more later. Going back to the book. Nonetheless, the act of stepping out that morning in Yosefov meant leaving one's comrades and admitting that one was too weak or cowardly. Who would have dared, one policeman declared emphatically, to lose face before the assembled troops? If the question is posed to me why I shot with the others in the first place, said another who subsequently asked to be excused after several rounds of killing, I must answer that no one wants to be thought a coward. It was one thing to refuse at the beginning, he added, and quite another to try and shoot but not be able to continue. Another policeman, more aware of what truly required courage, said quite simply, I was cowardly. So that person gets it.
Yeah.
These people are, the shooters are saying, hey, I didn't want to be a coward, so I wanted to go shoot.
Right.
When actually, to stand up and say, no, that's what would have taken real moral courage at this point. And obviously, these guys knew what they were doing was wrong.
Yeah.
They knew it. That's why some of them weren't able to continue.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of cowardly, here's a little section that I thought should be pointed out, and we were talking about this before the podcast, how people rationalize things.
Yeah.
Well, listen to this rationalization. Perhaps the most astounding rationalization of all was that of a 35-year-old metal worker from Bremerhaven. Quote, I made the effort, and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mothers led the children by the hand. My neighbor then shot the mother, and I shot the child that belonged to her, because I reasoned with myself that after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing to my conscience to release the children unable to live without their mothers. And actually, he goes in here and talks about the German word for release also means to like redeem or save. So this guy's really twisted things up in his head.
Yeah.
The dangers of rationalization right there. Good God. Back to the book. With few exceptions, the whole question of anti-Semitism is marked by silence. So this is interesting. This is very interesting. I should have pointed this out earlier, but this book is based on all these different interviews and witness accounts, mostly of the policemen themselves. Now, and again, I should have pointed this out in the beginning. Of course, people are making witness statements, and there's all kinds of problems with those, right? They don't remember things correctly. Yeah. They're trying to protect themselves. They're trying to protect their friends. They're trying to indict certain people and make them look like the bad guy. They might be trying to make themselves look good. So there's all these kind of angles that you have to listen to. You have to understand this with.
Yeah.
But this is interesting. As they interview these guys, back to the book, with few exceptions, the whole question of anti-Semitism is marked by silence. What is clear is that the men's concern for their standing in the eyes of their comrades was not matched by any sense of human ties with their victims. The Jews stood outside their circle of human obligation and responsibility. Such a polarization between us and them, between one's comrades and the enemy, is of course standard in war, and it is indeed. But I guess what surprised me is these guys weren't going in there with thinking to themselves, okay, these are the Jews that are doing us wrong and we're going to get our chance. They were just kind of saying, well, they're not us,
Right.
so we'll do what we have to do.
Yeah.
Back to the book. Even 20 or 25 years later, those who did quit shooting along the way overwhelmingly cited sheer physical revulsion against what they were doing as the prime motive, but did not express any ethical or political principles behind this revulsion. So that's interesting. These guys were stopping because it made them feel sick.
Yeah.
And they weren't saying, look, I'm actually... What I've been saying is like, hey, these guys knew it was wrong. Yeah. Well, they didn't think of it as wrong, or at least this is explaining that they weren't thinking, oh, this is so wrong.
Right.
What they were thinking was, I'm going to be sick. Now, any rational person can figure out that if something makes you sick to do, then you've got some deep-seated knowledge that what you're doing is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like that was like the moral part of it, right or wrong and stuff. That wasn't the primary. The primary was just, I can't take the blood and guts, man.
I can't take the blood and guts. Yeah, you're exactly right. Now, like I said, there's a connection, and I don't think he makes it in the book, but in my mind, there's a connection. If you're doing something that makes you feel sick, it's not just the making you feel sick that should be bothering you. What should be bothering you is the fact that you're doing something that makes you feel sick. There's a reason why it makes you feel sick. There's a reason why human beings feel sick when they're laying down children and shooting in the back of the head. There's a reason for that. That's like a survival instinct, right? For your species to carry on.
Yeah.
You have to make the other members of your species survive.
Yeah. Especially if just like how you said, there wasn't like some enemy kind of feeling towards these people. Like it's not like, oh, we're defending ourselves against this enemy. It wasn't that. It was just that it was essentially the minimum requirement to go against somebody. They're not us.
Yeah, and he's going to go into this a little bit, but yeah, you're right. It's not like there's. He says, hey, there's women and children being bombed back in Germany right now, but there's no direct correlation. They're not saying, hey, look, these Jews are fighting us. They're gonna take over. They've got ground in on our borders. No, they're not saying that. They're actually in total control of the Jews at this point. Or they're not total control, but they're getting really close. Getting really close. Back to the book. The resentment and bitterness in the battalion over what they had been asked to do in Yosefov was shared by virtually everyone, even those who had shot the entire day. The exclamation of one policeman to First Sergeant Kammer of the 1st Company that I'd go crazy if I had to do that again expressed the sentiments of many. But few went beyond complaining to extricate themselves from such a possibility. So they all said, hey, I hope I never have to do that again.
Yeah.
But very few of them actually made a stand. The most dramatic, back to the book, the most dramatic response again was that of Lieutenant Buckman, who asked Trapp to have him transferred back to Hamburg and declared that short of a direct personal order from Trapp, he would not take part in Jewish actions. In the end, he wrote to Hamburg explicitly requesting a recall because he was not suited to certain tasks alien to the police that were being carried out by his unit in Poland. Buckman had to wait until November, but his efforts to be transferred were ultimately successful. So there's a guy that's one guy that they're citing that actually said, dude, I'm not gonna do this. Now, it was bad enough and did have a bad enough effect on the men, and they complained about it enough that there was some changes. So here we go back to the book. In subsequent actions, 2 vital changes were introduced henceforth, with some notable exceptions adhered to. First, most of the future operations of the Reserve Police Battalion 101 involved ghetto clearing and deportation, not outright massacre on the spot. The policemen were thus relieved of the immediate horror of the killing process, which for deportees from the northern Lublin district was carried out in the extermination camp at Treblinka. So now we're not going to, you don't have to go shoot them. You just got to gather them up and get them shipped off to the extermination camp. Second, while deportation was a horrifying procedure characterized by the terrible coercive violence needed to drive people onto the death trains, as well as the systematic killing of those who could not be marched to the trains, these actions were generally undertaken jointly by units of Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Tronikis, SS-trained auxiliaries from the Soviet territories recruited from the Russian POW camps and usually assigned to the very worst parts of the ghetto clearing and deportation. So imagine this group. You get a group of thugs that are from Russian POW camps, and you say, oh yeah, we'll let you out of this POW camp and you can come work for us. And they're trained by the SS. Not exactly a friendly crew of guys. In fact, that's like, I can't imagine a worse group of people to come and come after you.
Yeah.
Back to the book. The bulk of the killing was to be removed to the extermination camp, and the worst of the on-the-spot dirty work was to be assigned to the Tronikis. This change would prove sufficient to allow the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 to become accustomed to their participation in the final solution. When the time came to kill again, the policemen did not go crazy. Instead, they became increasingly efficient and calloused executioners. So, a couple changes. It was a little too much for them to actually do all the killing themselves. Now they got some people to help them out, or they are just going to gather them up and ship them away, and now they're only playing a little piece in the machine.
Yeah.
Right? Just a little piece of the machine, so it's a lot easier to detach from what's actually happening. Back to the book. The Jews of Lomazi were to be the target of Reserve Battalion 101's first joint killing action with a unit from the Troniki. Second company was to provide the bulk of the manpower for the roundup. The primary function of the Troniki unit was to provide the shooters, thus alleviating the chief psychological burden the German policemen had experienced at Yosefov. And here the orders come out. They're going in, and now there's another term that comes up. It has to do with the Troniki, but it's Hiwis, and it's short. I forget what the German words are, but Hiwis is short for two big German words. One of them that means willing, and one of them that means helper. So they called these sort of people that had come to the German side and were not. They called them Hiwis, and it's like I said, it stands for willing helper. It's like using. You ever heard the term spec war? That stands for special warfare. Yeah. This is the same thing with two German words that mean willing helper. So here we go back to the book. The NCOs were told that the Hiwis from Troniki would do the shooting. So the policemen would, for the most part, be spared. Nonetheless, the roundup was to be conducted as had been done before, which is to say that infants and the old, sick, and frail who could not be easily taken to the assembly point were to be shot on the spot. So not out of all the killing. According to one squad leader, however, most children were once again brought to the assembly point. As in Yosefov, the men encountered not only German Jews, but specifically Hamburg Jews during the clearing action. The Jews quickly filled the schoolyard and overflowed into the adjoining sports field. With some shooting, the roundup was finished in 2 short hours. So that's a real sort of one sentence, and if you can just try and imagine what the hell is going on there, these soldiers, these Russian soldiers, these German soldiers are coming in and rounding people up. They're using violence, shooting people to get all the Jews into the schoolyard. This is a nightmare scenario that he puts in a sentence here. Back to the book. The 1,700 Jews of Lumazi were then forced to sit and wait. A group of 60 to 70 young men were selected out, given shovels and spades, loaded onto trucks, and driven to the woods. Several of the young Jews jumped from the moving trucks and made good their escape. Another attacked a German corporal, the battalion boxing champion, who promptly knocked his desperate assailant senseless. In the woods, the Jews were set to digging a mass grave. Back in Lumazi, the wait of the doomed Jews and their police guards stretched into hours. Suddenly, a contingent of 50 Hiwis from Troninki marched into town, led by a German SS officer. I can still remember it exactly, one policeman testified, that immediately after the arrival of these Tronikis took a break. After their arrival, the Tronikis took a break. I saw that in addition to food, they also took out bottles of vodka out of their packs and drank from them. The SS officer and Gnad, this is a guy that arrived on the scene now, Gnade, began drinking heavily as well. The other NCOs smelled of alcohol, but unlike the two commanders, were not visibly drunk. So these guys are drinking vodka, and they know what they're about to have to go do. Now we're talking about this guy, Lieutenant Gnade. Lieutenant Gnade was a Nazi by conviction and an anti-Semite. He was also unpredictable, affable, and approachable at times, brutal and vicious at others. And here's an eyewitness account from one of the soldiers. Back to the book. Even before the shooting began, First Lieutenant Gnade had personally picked out some 20 to 25 elderly Jews. They were exclusively men with full beards. Gnade made the old men crawl on the ground in the area before the grave. Before he gave them the order to crawl, they had to undress. While the totally naked Jews crawled, First Lieutenant Gnade screamed to those around, "Where are my non-commissioned officers? Don't you have any clubs yet?" The non-commissioned officers went to the edge of the forest, fetched themselves clubs, and vigorously beat the Jews with them. They get the mass grave dug. And here we go. Immediately, large numbers of Jews were driven into the grave, and the Hiwis took their position on the walls that had been thrown up. From there, they shot the victims. As the shooting continued, the grave began to fill. The Jews who followed had to climb on and later even clamber over those shot earlier because the grave was filled with corpses almost to the edge. The NCOs decided that the execution should continue with 2 firing squads on opposite sides of the grave. The Jews were forced to lie down in rows alongside each side of the grave and were shot by the police standing on the opposite wall. Men from all 3 platoons were formed into squads of 8 to 10 and were relieved by others in a rotation after 5 or 6 shots. After about 2 hours, the Hiwis were roused from their stupor and resumed shooting in place of the German policemen. The shooting was finished around 7 p.m., and the work Jews who had been kept aside covered the grave. The work Jews were then shot as well. The thin covering of the overfilled grave continued to move. So you got people that are not dead, that are now buried alive. And there was a part that I didn't cover. Basically, the Hiwis got too drunk to continue on, and the police had to go and take their place for a while, and then they kind of recovered. But this is the situation that we're talking about. Just a complete nightmare.